Hello! Hopefully, you've had a chance now to listen to the four previous episodes looking at the professional tracks of four different professors and academics here in different fields of study at Virginia Tech. Now, in this combined program, you'll get to hear some of their thoughts, feelings, and experiences with museums. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. So, Shuhai, over your long career, you've worked with collections from numerous institutions, and you have encouraged your students to seek out additional museums to work with and other repositing institutions. What are some museums and collections that have stood out to you, either because you've particularly enjoyed them or you think that they have very well-developed programs and collections?
Yeah, so over the years, I have worked with a number of museums and collections, including the museums and at the repository at the Nanjing Institute of Geology and Paleontology, the Peabody Museum at Yale, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Museum of Comparative Zoology, MCZ, and the paleobotany collection at Harvard University. So I think that probably my most interaction, of course, is with the paleobotany collection at Harvard University. Is part of the herbarium. So the herbarium has a lot of plant collections, but there's a paleofossil plant collection within the herbarium. So
is that where a lot of the Ediacaran microfossils that you work with, like the acritarchs, will get stored?
Yeah, so most of my material is reposited or deposited at the paleobotany collection.
That's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, as well as a lot of Precambrian. So Precambrian paleontology started in the 1950s, and one of the professors who started the field was Elso Barkholm, and he was at Harvard. So all his collections were stored at the paleobotany collection. And so were my advisors, Andy North's collection, so Precambrian, and some of Bill Schaaf's and Stan Ormick's collections. Bill and Stan are also Precambrian paleobiologists who started their graduate school at Harvard under Elso Barkholm. So all three of them, Andy North, Bill Schaaf, and Stan Ormick. So it has a very rich collection of Precambrian microfossils, and I had the opportunity to look at some of them. So it's very useful, and so I think that imagine that all the material they coming from Australia, Canada, China, South Africa, they're stored in a single room.
And certainly a lot easier than trying to do field work in each of those individual.
Yeah, and some of them from Svalbard, and there's no way that you can go there to collect your own material. It involves a helicopter and a lot of logistic challenges. So yeah, I think that's is a great resources for any student who is interested in Precambrian paleobiology. And my interaction with the Peabody and Smithsonian is mostly somebody worked on some British shale thing and some Ediacaran material in these two institutions. And since I moved to Virginia Tech, a lot of work in South China, and I developed a very deep collaboration with colleagues in Nanjing in China, and they have a good repository of fossils, fossil plants, and invertebrate animals. They have a very good repository. And this is not just Precambrians, anything from Precambrian to the Phanerozoic. So yeah, and most of my recent material from the Ediacaran, they're reposited in Nanjing.
Are there any collections or institutions that you would like to personally explore or visit that you've not yet had the chance to do so?
Yeah, interesting. One of the collections I always want to visit is the Ediacaran collection from the White Sea area in Russia. And as I understand, most of the material is reposited in the Institute or the Paleontology Institute or Institute of Paleontology in Moscow. So the part of the Russian Academy of Sciences. I think this is I've seen some of the material reposited in the Namibian Geological Survey. I've seen the South Australia material reposited in the South Australian Museum in Adelaide. So the Russian material, the White Sea material, is really something I look forward to exploring in the future.
Well, hopefully that field trip that it was Ilya Babovsky was working on organizing that, right?
Yeah, they have been talking about this for some time now. So I hope sooner or later there'll be a field trip and there'll be an opportunity to visit the museum as well.
Here's hoping. Here's hoping. Well, thank you again for your time today, Shuhai, and thank you for your perspectives.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Morrison.
Okay, so now in this segment, we're going to go to the Muview side of things, where we're going to talk about museums. And so obviously you have a lot of experience with natural history collections. You've worked with plant collections at Cornell, at Duke, in Alaska, and here at Virginia Tech. What are some major plant collections that you would like to work with or visit at some point that you've not had the chance to?
Well, there's a few famous herbaria that I've never been able to visit. So maybe the biggest in terms of reputation or gravity is Kew in England. So I would love to visit the Kew Botanical Gardens and their herbarium someday, even if it wasn't just for a research project. Just being able to go and see it would be pretty amazing, I think. A lot of the collections I visited have actually been more on the smaller regional side. So there's actually still a lot, even just in the US, that I haven't been to. So I've been to the Smithsonian a couple times, but
it's nice when you live only about 4 hours away from it.
oh, actually, those visits were when I lived in Alaska. So yeah.
One is reminded of that old joke about the cobbler's children's shoes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I probably should, once COVID's over, try to get back there. But yeah, the Missouri Botanical Garden in the U.S. is one that I'd really like to get to. It's one of the largest in the world, and they do some pretty amazing efforts that I've been a part of before. They worked with a lot of researchers in China to produce the flora of China, and they'd at least for the fern volume, they'd pair up a Chinese fern researcher with an American counterpart for that group. So maybe the genus or the family. So I was able to help with my grad school study genus and be part of that project. And I had their specimens on loan and things, but I've never actually been to the botanical gardens or to the herbarium. So I'd really love to visit that one as well.
You mentioned that you have some kids, and I'd imagine you probably either you've taken them or they've gone on a school field trip to some children's science museum somewhere. What kind of things would you like to see youth science museums incorporate for their outreach and their displays to kind of bring the world of plants more to kids? Since that's not necessarily the first thing you think about when you think about the kinds of things that children's museums show their visitors.
Well, for most of them, probably any coverage of plants. But for that age group, I feel like either the plants we eat or ethnobotany are probably the easiest ways to broach that. So talking about trees that you can make medicine out of, or talking about plants that we cultivate and where they came from and things. Those are probably the easiest way.
There'd
but yeah.
probably be a lot of parents who'd really hate it if their kids learned that they could complain about broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and Brussels sprouts all as the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Or, maybe that lesson on local psychoactive plants isn't the best one for a children's museum, but yeah, really just any coverage. But those would probably be the two easiest ways.
So outside of the world of herbaria, are there any museums that you have personal connection to?
Well, I worked for almost 10 years at the Museum of the North. That's the museum that's on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. So, I did my research there. I was actually a staff member while I did the research, so I helped curate specimens and I helped run our public programs and things. So I've got a pretty long, association with that one. It was a neat institution. It really changed seasonally a lot. So in the summertime, almost all of our visitation was people coming up on cruise ships or a small set who were driving RVs up to Alaska. So that tended to skew older and American. So typically American retirees were our summer crowd. And then in the winter, we tried to do local programs with local schools and things. And about the only tourists we would get in winter were charter groups, mostly from Japan. So we had kind of in the winter local kids and working age Japanese families. And in the summer, we usually had kind of retirees or other American families. So it was a big switch in the from kind of season to season. But just because of the history that museum, I learned so much about the field there and got to try so many different things and work with so many neat people that are still my friends that would probably be the closest one. Yeah.
It's quite a ways away, but there's a museum slash historical site in kind of that part of the world that I really want to visit at some point. My favorite poet for a while lived in a town in the Yukon territory of Canada called Dawson City. And so the house that he lived in is now a historical site that I would like to go visit at some time. But like a lot of places in that part of the world, it's a 10-hour drive from anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, I did. I was able to visit the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territory driving to and from Alaska, but yeah, it's kind of a long haul. You're not, like you were saying, going there for an afternoon outing or anything. That's probably the museum I have the closest relationship with, but probably my favorite museum was called the Pratt Museum. It was in Homer, Alaska.
Mm.
So there's this big peninsula, the Kenai Peninsula, that's just south of Anchorage. So it's in the Pacific Ocean, and Homer's a small town on the west side of it. Seward's the small town on the east side of it. And this museum was in Homer, so it's kind of community museum, very small. It was kind of an old, I don't know, farmhouse or family house that had been converted into a museum. So it was this very small place. Think a lot of volunteer labor. It always just amazed me how both kind of comprehensive and impactful it was. So they had these gorgeous botanical gardens outside. I don't know who was in charge of this, but they had someone who was cultivating rare Alaskan orchids and things that were really hard to see in
Alaskan
the
orchids.
wild.
I didn't even know that there were such a thing.
Yeah, yeah. If you know, there's a bunch of different kinds, but these ones that I'm thinking of, if you know our local lady slippers,
Mhm.
so there's the pink lady slipper with the big pouch, and there's the yellow species, and there's a white species with pink dots. This one was much smaller and had dark purple dots on it, Cypripedium guttatum. But then inside, they had a lot of displays that were all about the local area. And the one that always stuck with me was this little booth in the basement. It was set up to look like a cabin on a ship. And they had recordings from people because it was a big fishing town. And there were recordings of people talking about the time they went out fishing and, half the crew didn't come back or waiting for their father and he never returned or, their aunt who went out and supported the family by fishing. And there were all these personal tales that were really relevant to the community. And I remember just being a really emotional exhibit. Like it was one that really, really hit you hard and really connected with you. But it was one that museum just always kind of did a really good job of capitalizing on the local environment. It was a small place, but all their exhibits were just really well done and really geared to the local community or the local ecosystem.
Local history museums like that certainly do a lot of work kind of preserving interesting family histories and community histories. A lot of my mother's family lives in rural northwestern Ohio, near Wood County, Ohio, where there's the Wood County Museum, and an interesting kind of family heirloom of our families is stored and displayed there. Is, I believe, my either great great grandfather. I'd have to look up my exact relationship to him, but a man named Raymond Kenneth Stroh was a doctor there, and his patient chair that he would treat people on is now on display at the Wood County Museum.
That's pretty neat to be able to see that kind of family connection.
Yeah, another relative of mine was a American Army serviceman during World War One, and his uniform and some of his other clothes and equipment are part of a broader collection, some of which is on display of World War One memorabilia from that community, and that's kind of neat to see.
That actually reminds me, but when I was talking about the Museum of the North, I was talking about, my work there with the plant collection, but it wasn't just a natural history museum. So we had a large archaeological, ethnographic, so basically human history, more recent than archaeology, and art collections there. So I was able to work with those curators there, and that was a really neat experience. The ethnography curator would get these crazy donations, old coffee cans from gold mine camps from 100 years ago, so you could see what they were eating and drinking then, and some of them were using the
Exactly how
label.
much lead.
Yeah, yeah, some of them would use the labels to keep their diaries on, so you could see their
Mm,
diaries. She did a lot with Native Alaskan communities, so some days the windows to her lab would be blacked out because she was dealing with sacred objects
mm.
that it wasn't appropriate for people outside of the tribe to be seeing. So you'd walk by and everything would be blacked out because she was dealing with these sacred items. And it was a really neat learning experience. Like I'd always been in spots that were just natural history collections, but it was a really neat perspective to get that kind of cultural or human side of it.
I bet between the native communities' material contributions and the material history of the gold miners and the sailors, there's probably a lot of interesting scrimshaw in that collection.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was always a neat aisle to look at. Yeah, I mean, I was I was about to say they were museum quality pieces, but obviously they were. But yeah, just incredibly spectacular things. Some hundreds of years old, some contemporary, but yeah, it was always neat. Even other parts of the collection, the mammal collection shared an aisle with us, so you could walk down and see all these narwhal tusks or walrus skulls, and it was always really neat to be able to see that kind of exotic material there.
Marine mammals have really weird skeletons and skulls, especially.
Turns out they smell really bad too when they decompose. We would get donations in. So for the plant collection, this wasn't a problem. But, when a weird animal washes up on shore and they fly it into the museum for dissection and preservation, the entire back half of the museum would just stink, just this nauseating stench that I learned was typical of marine mammals. So I guess
So
how oily they are, maybe. I don't know.
I did my undergrad degrees at University of Georgia, and while there, I had an internship at the Georgia Museum of Natural History, and I also had another internship with an anthropologist there who worked with the Georgia Museum. But one of the Georgia Museum of Natural History's claim to fame is that they have one of the world's largest collections of whale skeletons.
Hmm.
And I never worked with it personally, and in fact, most of their stuff was kept on an offsite storage facility. But I know that they had to move it around a lot during the time period that I was there, as the museum was resizing. But I can only assume that there were some interesting smells that were encountered by the people working with that material.
Oh yeah,
Because
yeah.
I also recall that, like, while I was there, some other local, well, semi-local museums that had whale skeletal material closed down and ended up giving their stuff to our museum.
Yeah, that's another issue, but orphan collections, but
Yeah, which especially is an issue right now here because of COVID. Something like a third of U.S. museums are probably going to close permanently, and how are we going to keep track of all that stuff? That's something I've tried a little bit to keep abreast of, but as a person who relies on natural history collections, we got a lot to do to protect all this stuff.
yeah, yeah, you hear the horror stories about, the curator retires or passes away, and then the department throws everything in the trash bin, and it's yeah, it's a permanent loss.
So on a little bit kind of more cheery news, once it becomes a little bit more safe to travel, are there any museums that either you'd like to visit on your own or that you'd like to take your family to that you haven't been to before?
Well, we haven't been to the remodeled Smithsonian Natural History Museum, so I'd love to take my kids there. I've heard the dinosaur exhibit is really pretty incredible after the renovation. For me personally, right when COVID hit, I was about to go to a conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I was really excited to visit some of the herbaria and museums there, but then that was canceled. So I'm hoping that someday that conference will be reheld and I'll be able to go. So that would be a neat one to be able to get to soon.
Nice, nice. Well, thank you again for your time, and glad to hear on your thoughts on museums.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Morrison.
Okay, so for part two and kind of the more Mew side of the Muview with Mo, we're going to talk a little bit now with Dr. Walter Lee about his relationship to museums. As a kid, I always enjoyed getting to go to a lot of different museums. I grew up in the greater Atlanta area, and so I frequently visited Fernbank Science Center and the Fernbank Planetarium, which, despite having the same name, were actually not related. But were there any museums that kind of you grew up with or that you enjoyed going to frequently as a child?
As a child, I would say no. I don't know if, so I'm from South Carolina, and I don't like thinking back. I don't remember there being museums around often. And like, I just don't think that was like not a central thing. I think my exposure to museums and experience with them has more so come probably as a graduate student and faculty member. And I think some of that has to do more so with like, once I started traveling more, once I started looking for more alternative forms of entertainment that don't necessarily always get promoted as the type of entertainment that my peers were doing as a young person. So like, I don't think I had a lot of experience with museums as much as like occasionally, like, I don't know if like we might've taken a field trip somewhere to like see something related to history, but it wasn't necessarily like this thing that was promoted as like, you should be excited about and I don't think I don't know if South Carolina has any museum that people in other states would be like, I'm going to go see this thing.
I can't think of any offhand, but that's probably just because I've not spent a lot of time looking at South Carolina's museums. A friend of mine has some associations with the North Carolina Museum of Natural History, and they have some pretty neat stuff, but I can't offhand think of interesting museums in South Carolina. Or actually, I take that back. I have done some work with some archaeologists who do a lot of work in Charleston, and I can't remember names of institutions offhand, but I know that there are a number of historical institutions in and affiliated with Charleston. So for the history folks, there are some interesting things there.
Yeah, and I'm from outside of Charleston. That's why I was like, I'm pretty sure like I've gone to some of these historic sites.
Yeah.
Classified in museums, but like I definitely couldn't pinpoint or name one to be like, I remember going here and it was a wonderful time. Because like also like the museums in South Carolina are not glorifying the stuff that I'm particularly going out my way to go see either. Like a lot of them are, like I'm looking at a lot of these, a lot of them are like military or and like
if you're curious, the thing that I was doing specifically is I had an internship with the Georgia Museum of Natural History, and I was sorting through bone material from a pre-Columbian midden somewhere a little bit south of Charleston, and so I was sorting through different animal bones that essentially were like in waste piles, and using that to kind of see what all things indigenous inhabitants were eating and were using. It's a lot more alligator than I really would have expected. You'd think alligator would be something that you would kind of avoid and not want to tangle with, but I found like 5 or 6 individual different alligators in just the material I was working with.
There are a lot more. I Googled list of museums in South Carolina. So I think in my head, I was thinking of museums as being like the real big ones only.
Mm-hmm.
And like there are way more museums in South Carolina than I realized, because I think a lot of these are like historical sites that I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have necessarily in my head, I wouldn't have necessarily classified like a historic house as a museum. So like I think some of these things just didn't register in my like conceptual understanding of what it means to be a museum.
So more recently though, are there museums that you've enjoyed getting to visit or learn more about?
I'm not going to be able to tell you the exact names of them, but I can talk about.
That's okay. I can look them up later and put them into the description.
Yeah. So I actually enjoy the ones in DC and kind of just broadly exploring those. Mm-hmm. So the one focused on African American history, I need to go back. I went once with a group of students from Virginia Tech, and I did not do enough research to understand how it was laid out. So I don't know if you've been there or not before, but like history is at the bottom and then like all the cultures up top. But like there was a lot of people going down and I didn't know how it was structured. So I just went at the top. So I was like, I went to the top and started working my way down and actually never made it to the very bottom. So like I remember like after the trip, people being like, that was so heavy and like there was so much sad stuff. And because I started at the top and went down, I had literally just spent the afternoon looking at all the wonderful events and accomplishments. Like I never got to any of the stuff about chattel slavery in the United States. Like it was like that's one of the places I'm like, oh, I should probably go back. But like I enjoyed seeing all the culture part and absent of the history part. Like I would have went to see the history part. I didn't know enough about the museum to appropriately decide how I wanted to go through it. And I think that like as a novice person walking through, I don't know if it had necessarily registered to me that this building might be designed in a way that they want you to go through it in this certain way. It was, to me, it was much more just registering like, oh, there's a collection of stuff. I can just walk around and I'll see what I see.
That is kind of, in some respects, a good problem to have, that, you know, you have a big enough space that you can't get through all of it in one visit.
You know, so there's a lot of stuff there. And like, that was definitely a real good experience, primarily because like it centered the group I belong to, which I always think is like, I would imagine that the closer relationship people have with the content in the museum probably does have some impact on their experience. And then like, I remember going through like the science one, the space one, I believe they have one on like nature. Like I've went through a decent amount of the ones there. And like, I just think that that's a cool environment to walk through. And then the other space. So I've participated with the Rising Sophomore Abroad program that the Department of Engineering Education hosts. And then beyond the engineering destinations, we also do a lot of cultural stuff. So I remember we were in Spain. We went to 2 different art museums that I cannot remember the name of, but like they were both. One of them was supposed to be like one of like the best art museums like in Spain. So like I could probably look it up, but I don't remember off the top of my head. And then the other one I think we went to was kind of just another one that was real close that we went to, and I remember both of those being pretty cool. And I think we like randomly went to like a science museum that was probably targeted towards kids, but it was still interesting for us to kind of explore through, especially in a different country, just to kind of see what shows up. Those are probably I think those might be the extent to which the ones that have been real memorable to me. So like the ones I've seen in Spain and then the ones in DC.
I was in Spain briefly last year for a conference and field trip. And one of the other attendees was a professor from Brazil. And one of the things that he was really excited for was that after the conference and field trip was over, he was going to go to a couple of the big art museums in Spain. So he was also really pumped for that, getting to see some of like the De Goya stuff and some of the other major art that they have there. There is always a lot of nice stuff tucked away in different areas. And
yeah, we went to the Prado Museum.
Oh, okay, the Prado, yeah.
Yeah, so that was nice. Yeah, and that's what I said. It was the world-renowned Museo Nacional del Prado. It's widely considered to have one of the world's finest collections of European art. Yeah, so that was cool. And I feel like when you're in another country, because like we also toured like churches, like a lot of history just feels like a museum.
Mm-hmm.
So like in general, I think a lot of the stuff we saw when we were in Spain and Morocco was pretty cool.
Oh, you also got to go to Morocco?
Yeah, so we spent about a week in Spain and then took a boat down to Morocco for about a week as well. The trips are usually 2 weeks long. And then depending on which country you go to, a lot of times there's bouncing around. So like one year when I went to Australia, we just stayed in Australia, but we moved across different cities. But then when I went to Spain, we actually went to Spain and Morocco, and there are other European tracks where they hit a bunch of countries.
Nice. Well, thank you again for your time, Dr. Walter Lee.
No problem.
Now for the part of the show where we talk about museums. Growing up, were there any museums that you visited a lot as a kid? That's a question that I ask a lot of my interviewees.
Yeah, so I was at a very young age, probably like ages 3 to 6. I knew more about whales than I ever did since. I have forgotten far more about whales than I did then. And we would go to aquariums like up and down the coast, learning about, and my parents would drive me around and I would learn about whales. So that was kind of my first exposure to, I guess, sort of any sort of natural history and sort of thing. And then I grew up in Oregon. We would go to Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, which was always really fun. I remember I was really into anatomy for a while. And so, I'd memorize like anatomical parts and whatever. And there were some exhibits that came through that were pretty amazing to see when I was a kid. So those are kind of my earliest, I guess, any sort of museum memories.
Nice, nice. And so, as a scientist of natural history, as a biologist, you've talked about you named a frog species, and so associated with that, you've probably done some museum work where material that you've collected has gone to museums. What are some museums that you've worked with, or collections that you've worked with for your research?
So the main one is Cal Academy when I did my internship there. So I went through hundreds of these little frog specimens that had been already collected. And I was working through these old species descriptions where they had described two species that differed based on like the ratio of two little bumps on their feet to each other. And so I had to measure each of these things and figure out if that was a valid thing or not. It wasn't. And then later I got to go with them on a couple expeditions to Sao Tome and Principe and actually collect those specimens myself. I also did some museum work or specimen preparation for my PhD working on garter snakes.
So are there any specific museums collections that you would like to work with at some point, but that you have not yet had the chance to conduct research on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always love going to museums and seeing the specimens, but as far as like, is there a specific collection that I'd like to work with? It really, the way I kind of arrive at my questions is not quite organism focused like that. So it's often like, oh, this is an interesting evolutionary question. What data can we get, right? And so what data is available, right? And so oftentimes, unfortunately, for a lot of the things, like there's not single museums that have all the, because we're doing things across species. So, a data point is a single species. So oftentimes we're looking for, breadth across the phylogeny. And that usually means that we can't go to a single museum if we wanted to get, all the measurements of a particular trait in a group of organisms. And so that usually means that you probably need to go to several museums to get all those measurements.
So when, COVID finally passes and everybody's vaccinated and things are back to a new normal, are there any museums that you'd like to visit that you haven't had the chance to yet?
So I did visit the American Museum of Natural History, but it was an incredibly short visit, and that was actually just pre-pandemic. I gave a seminar there, and I would love to go back and actually have some time to really just sit down and explore the museum. Yeah, and I guess given our proximity, I would love to get a better view of the collections at the Smithsonian, like kind of behind the scenes and that sort of thing.
It is nice being only 4 hours away from DC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
In kind of the opposite direction of Virginia, I'd like to swing by Saltville at some point and see. I know it's not a huge public facility, but it would be kind of nice to see some of that site and some of their collections, if only for the historical things for the early mammoth and mastodon excavations that they did.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'd also like to visit the Mothman Museum in nearby West Virginia.
I haven't actually heard about that one. I heard about the story, but I did not know there was a museum for it.
Yeah. The place where a lot of the story comes from is I forget exactly how far away, but it's a short little day trip away. So, on my way to a conference once, we passed by signs for the museum, so I know a roundabout where it is.
Awesome.
Okay, well, thank you, and I was glad to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much.